dann da...
Das kannst du machen, wie du willst.
Okay, ich glaube, ich setze mich dann da ins Publikum und komme dann wieder, wenn du fertig bist, die Diskussion zu moderieren. So ist es normalerweise. Hier ist es normalerweise so, bei den Rechtswissenschaftlern bleiben die dann immer irgendwie sitzen, alle die irgendwie mit der Organisation zu tun haben, werden dann an den Tisch gerufen und sitzen da dann sinnlos rum. Was teilweise dann ganz interessant ist, wenn man so beobachten kann, was das Publikum so macht.
Ihr Gesicht.
Aber es ist halt auch blöd, wenn man die ganze Zeit dabei gefilmt wird. Wenn man zweimal sein Wasser verschüttet und so.
Genau. Also interessante Form, das jetzt zu verpacken.
Ja, aber hier gibt es das ganz oft. Ich sehe doch diese Becher da haben, die dann nicht immer so ganz leicht zu öffnen sind. Wenn die eine Konkurrenzveranstaltung machen. Habilitation ist hier der Führerschein.
Oh, den habe ich.
Ich glaube doch nicht, dass das in seiner Vorstellung gehört. Ui. Ich habe irgendwann mal so ein Poster fotografiert, steht Habilitation suspensa e o resolvo.
Was heißt das?
Also, ja, ist der Führerschein, haben Sie Ihren Führerschein verloren oder was? Ich löse das Problem sozusagen. Aber so aus der deutschen Perspektive, ne? Sie haben Sie Ihre Habilitation irgendwie unterbrochen.
Kommt ja auch manchmal vor.
Ich löse das Problem.
Ja, genau.
Dann haben Sie so, hey, da ruf ich doch mal an.
Ja, genau. Ist Habilitation eigentlich noch in?
Ist schwer zu sagen. Also der eine sagt so, der andere sagt so. Also ich habe wirklich da ganz widersprüchliche Ratschläge auch gehört, ob ich das noch machen soll oder nicht. All right, should we start with this very cozy setting with few people? All right, so welcome everybody to this talk this afternoon, which is kind of a special talk in the lecture series of the Department of Political Science. And thank you for being here, also because ERI has managed to set up a competing event at the same time. So we're really glad for everybody who's here. I'm not going to tell you what this event is about, not to risk that you think, oh, well, this is more interesting and leave. So our topic today is regional security organizations, and I'm going to present you now my colleague Matthias Dembinski, who just arrived this morning from Frankfurt in Germany. And he studied political science in Frankfurt at Goethe University, where he also obtained his PhD, and then started working at the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt, which is one of the these independent research institutes that exist in Germany that do not have a formal connection to the university. Is that right? It's more or less. I mean, there is to some extent there is a connection, because several of the people in the institute are also at the same time professors at the university. So, and sometimes there are joint appointments between the institute at the universities and things like that. But formally, I think it's an independent entity that focuses really on research in this area of peace and conflict studies. And yes, and Matthias has worked there ever since, if you want, with some research stays abroad, for instance, at Harvard University, and also another policy-related institute in Germany that at that time I think was in Bavaria, close to Munich, and has by now moved to Berlin. But most of the time working in Frankfurt on diverse topics, one being regional organizations, regional security organizations, with a particular focus on the European organizations such as NATO and the European Union. He has also worked on multilateralism more broadly, the question of international norms, how do international norms emerge, and more recently also the pushback against multilateralism and against international norms, and what does that mean to international for the management of international cooperation. And he's also working on a project on military humanitarian interventions. And this is a topic that we're going to deal with starting tomorrow afternoon, also in this room, in a workshop where Matthias and a number of other younger and more established scholars will participate, where we will discuss humanitarian interventions and also some other topics related to peace and conflict studies. And so actually I have been working together with Matthias in a research project that is thematically related to the topic of the talk today, because it also dealt with regional security organizations. It was called the International Organization of the Democratic Peace, the famous project which took place at the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt and at the University of Tübingen, where I was then appointed as a researcher at that time. Which was a project that focused on the regional security organizations' role in managing rivalries between states. And had 4 and then plus 1 more informal collaborator looking at different regions of the world and looking at different dyads of states, so pairs of states that were at some point in their history in conflict with each other. And then our hypothesis was, or the idea was to show how and if and how regional organizations or international institutions more broadly could contribute to the mitigation of these conflicts and rivalries. And whereas Matthias focused on the question of NATO and the Cyprus conflict, and in particular Greece and Turkey and their rivalry in the Mediterranean Sea, my role was actually to look at the South American dyads, looking at Brazil and Argentina and Chile. And interestingly, this was also the first motivation that brought me to Brazil for the first time. Back in, I rather won't tell you, because then I will date myself in terms of age, kind of. Long time ago, which is the first time that also brought me to Sao Paulo, and I did an interview with Rafael Villa, among other people. So that was also the first time I came to USP on a sunny Saturday morning with a taxi, meeting Rafael Villa in Nupri for this interview. So that's kind of, so just to sum that up, we know each other for quite a long time. We've published together on this question of regional security organizations, a number of things summarizing the results of this joint project. Yeah, and then we've been in touch more or less over the years, met on a couple of times at conferences, and then recently when I was at a conference in Frankfurt last year, and Matthias said, "Oh, I'm hoping that you will at some point invite me to Brazil." And I was like, yeah, why not? Let's do it. And it also nicely combined with this work that we started last year when Martin Binder was here, and we did a first workshop on humanitarian interventions. And then when I heard that Matthias is now working on a data set on humanitarian interventions, I thought that would be a great second kind of kickoff or idea for a second workshop to bring him here and congregate again also people interested in these questions of international institutions, international interventions, humanitarian interventions, etc. So the topic of today Matthias' talk today will look at regional security organizations as barriers or building blocks of global governance, the role of justice. So I'm already very curious, especially about this component, the role of justice, because the other part of the title, I can kind of imagine what he's going to talk about, but I'm not so sure about the role of justice. So I'm very curious to hear your talk. I'm very happy you are here. And you accepted to do this talk already on the day of your arrival, which is kind of tough. When you ever had an overnight 12-hour flight, you will know what I'm talking about. So I'm glad that you are here, and I will hand over to you now, and I'm looking forward to your talk.
Yeah, Britta, thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming. The findings that I'm going to present this evening on the place of regional security organizations in global governance are based on research that has been published in the European Journal of International Relations in 2017 and in Global Governance this year. I would like to start my presentation with a puzzle, the puzzle of the very unequal African reactions to the very similar interventions in Libya and in the Ivory Coast in 2011. And I somehow am fascinated by this puzzle, so please, I hope you excuse if I present it in some detail. In Libya, the Security Council had authorized a coalition of states with protecting civilians in the name of the responsibility to protect, R2P. Now, using Resolution 1973 as a kind of a blanket, this coalition in fact pursued regime change. NATO aircraft even attacked Gaddafi's convoy when he tried to escape the besieged city of Sirte. He survived the attack, but he was then captured, tortured, and killed by advancing rebels, and his body was put on public display in a freezer. Now, this incident, as well as the African reactions to it, is well known. Although the African Union had incorporated a kind of R2P in its founding act and had subscribed to this principle on several occasions, and although the African states on the Security Council in 2011 had voted in favor of Resolution 1973, the African Union then criticized the apparent overstretching of the resolution as a kind of an act of neocolonialism, and as a result, the R2P norm received a devastating blow in the Libyan desert, and whether it can be rescued or not is still an open question. In the Ivory Coast, simmering violence reignited when acting President Laurent Gbagbo refused to accept his defeat in presidential elections. And here, referring to the emerging protection of civilian norm, also POC, the Security Council in Resolution 1975 authorized a French and a UN mission to use force to protect civilians under imminent threat, but otherwise stay neutral. In the course of their protective operations, French soldiers stormed Gbagbo's compound and facilitated his arrest by forces loyal to his opponent. Now, French soldiers then described this act of regime change as a kind of accidental byproduct of their POC task. And although nobody in Africa took this assertion serious, the criticism was rather muted, and the African Union continued to advocate the POC norm and cooperation with the United Nations in implementing it. Now, this puzzle of these unequal reactions to similar events, this puzzle, interesting as it is for itself, also hints at a more general trend, and it poses an important question. The trend. Now, since the end of the Cold War, regional security organizations have mushroomed. And as I will argue in more detail later, this growth reacts to the emergence of global governance, and it indicates the aspirations of its members to control events in their regions and to use these organizations as a kind of gatekeeper between the global and the local level of states. Despite prevalent complaints about selectivity and double standards in global governance, often expressed from actors from the global south, the interaction between global and regional institutions is rather unequal or uneven and in fact resembles our puzzle. I mean, sometimes regional security organizations and the United Nations cooperate with each other. At other times, regional security organizations try to obstruct UN interventions in their region. Now, this, of course, raises an important question. When do regional security organizations facilitate and when do they oppose the implementation of global norms? More generally, when do they work as barriers and when do they work as building blocks of global governance? Before answering this question, I will briefly summarize the research on regional security organizations and changes in global governance, and then turn to the puzzle and the relevance of the concept of justice in solving it. The number of regional security organizations has almost tripled since the end of the East-West conflict, as new organizations have been founded and as existing economic organizations have extended their portfolio. Now, this rise of regional security organizations has attracted considerable academic interest in recent years. And most observers agree that their growth is at least partly conditioned by endogenous factors. Ernst Haas' theory of spillover, for example, is still around, and observers like Edward Mansfield, they too emphasize the close links between economic and security regionalism. Endogenous factors may also explain the institutional form that institutions or that regional security organizations take. And here, for example, researchers like Ethel Wolingen emphasize the preferences and capabilities of domestic coalitions who can either have a more international outlook or pursue an agenda of domestic protection. Other researchers stress the role of a common culture, the level of communication in the region, the nature of the cooperation problem, and the regime type of member states as factors that condition the emergence and the institutional form of regional security organizations. Most researchers, however, also note the simultaneous growth of those organizations across regions and emphasize exogenous drivers related to the end of the Cold War. Disputed, however, is the change in the is how changes in the geopolitical context impact on regional arrangements. One view argues that regions were in a certain way set free, and that regional logics came to predominate in the management of regional insecurity. And this, for example, explains, at least to some extent, the development of the European security and defense policy. There was always a sense in Europe that the Americans might somehow loosen their relationships with Europe, and that the Europeans themselves have to take on responsibility. This setting free of regions also explains to some extent the African endeavors in security building institutions, security institution building after the post-Somalia UN peacekeeping fatigue. Now, an alternative view argues that normative pressure from the global level did not abate, but dramatically increase during the 1990s and later, and that the growth of regional security organizations responds to the changed global incentive structure. And a brief look at the characteristics of global governance does indeed support this view. Let's see if this works. This global governance system is characterized by three features or layers in a certain way. First, a dense net of generalized and widely shared normative principles that refer to global goods, like the protection of civilians, or to transnational problems like climate change. Secondly, specific institutions which interpret and implement those norms. These institutions exert authority because their commands, demands, and requests do not fully rely on the principle of state consent. And this system is hierarchical because voice opportunities within global governance institutions are distributed unequally. And third, in contrast to domestic governance systems, global governance is fragmented, lacks legal oversight, depends on the capacity of powerful states, and is saturated with power politics. Now, from the point of view of states on the receiving end of global governance, this system, of course, then is a rather mixed blessing. It offers some opportunities, but it also poses challenges and risks. And to mention just the most important risk for those states. Problem, I guess, is that international norms, of course, are often rather abstract. They collide with other norms, and they can only provide general guidance rather than detailed prescriptions for every conceivable contingency. The question then, from the point of states on the receiving side of global governance, is, of course, that the problem that they face is that they have to assess whether global institutions and powerful states working within global institutions implement abstract norms in a rightful way, or whether they, when implementing norms in concrete situations, whether they then pursue ulterior motives. And this brings me back to the puzzle and the main question. When do regional organizations facilitate, and when do they block the implementation of global norms? When governments from the global south complain about selectivity, or when they try to object the implementation of norms such as R2P, although they have to agree to them in the first place, this is usually then taken by academic observers to indicate that these governments disagree with the substance of the norm. Proponents of norm diffusion theory, for example, would point to the fit between global norms and pre-existing local traditions and interests. Regional security organizations and their members then might have subscribed to global norms, but they understand their meaning or substance in a different way, namely in a way that fits with their traditions and interests. And those differences usually come to the fore only when abstract norms are implemented in concrete circumstances. In the case of our puzzle, proponents of this norm diffusion theory would argue that the African commitment to R2P was superficial, was always superficial, and never implied that heads of government would be made responsible for mass crimes committed in their name. They might then also employ case-specific explanations to resolve the puzzle mentioned earlier, like differences in the leader's standing or differences in the conflict situations that might affect the appropriateness of regime change in one case, but not in the other. In contrast, I emphasize the independent effect of procedural justice, or what's called procedural fairness, on the acceptability of norm implementation in both cases. In a nutshell, I argue that complaints about selectivity and double standards should be taken as an indicator that states perceive global governance in terms of justice. Justice is frequently referred to in public diplomacy. When you read speeches given before the Security Council, you will find that justice pops up everywhere. Yet international relations scholars, probably still influenced by Thomas Hobbes' verdict about justice having no place in interstate relations, tend to dismiss references to justice as just empty talk. Global justice is a main issue in international political theory, but has rarely been studied empirically as a motivation for political actors. And yet, the mentioned transformation of the international system from an anarchic state system to one of global governance suggests that states assess their treatment and the behavior of those actors yielding authority in terms of justice, like they do in domestic settings. And this lack of empirical justice research in international relations contrasts markedly with research in neighboring fields like social psychology. And I would argue that international relations would benefit greatly by incorporating this research. Empirical research began to flourish in the 1960s in social psychology and is by now firmly established in various social science disciplines like organizational theory or behavioral economics and stuff like that. And those guys really do great work, interesting work. So if you're interested in justice at all, you should read the studies of social psychologists. They have done a lot of field work and experimental studies, and it's really fascinating. For us and for our field, I think that two findings of this research are particularly interesting and relevant. First, feelings of justice or unjust treatment have a highly motivating force. I mean, we know that probably from our personal experiences. Whenever we feel that we have been treated unfair, unjust, we react with anger and with frustration. And so do most people. Justice judgments are linked to pro-social behavior, and experiences of injustice trigger antisocial behavior. Second interesting finding, two dimensions of justice are relevant. Distributive justice on the one hand and procedural justice on the other. Distributive justice refers to standards that determine how goods, material and immaterial, how goods ought to be shared. And procedural justice refers to the fairness of the procedures that lead to distributive decisions and that guide the application of general distributive norms in concrete situations. Now, both dimensions, and that's interesting or important, both dimensions are interrelated in the sense that weaknesses in one dimension may be compensated by strengths in the other. Actors are more likely to perceive even those outcomes as fair that do not conform to their initial expectations, provided that procedures were fair. In contrast, if they feel that procedures are biased against them, they will likely start to question the entire institution in charge of producing case-specific decisions. But when are procedures perceived as fair? The pioneering justice scholars John Thibault and Lawrence Walker emphasize the importance of process control that give affected parties the assurance that the process was correct and not biased against them. One of those guys was a social psychologist, the other was a lawyer, and of course they had the situation of a trial in mind. And there was the idea that when people before court, when they have a chance to really verify that the trial is fair, then they will also accept the verdict, even if the verdict does not conform to their expectations. However, if they have the feeling that the trial is unfair, that the judge, for example, is biased, then of course they will react with anger and will not accept the verdict as such. Now they as I said, they focus on process control. Another social psychologist, Gerald Leventhal, argued that the procedural justice depends on certain properties, like the impartiality of decision-taking bodies or the quality of information flowing into the process. Now, employing justice theory, three expectations regarding the regional reactions to global norms, norm application can be formulated. First, we should expect that actors from the global south care about procedural justice and will insist on procedural rights as a condition for accepting global norms, just for example, like the responsibility to protect. And second, the actual granting of procedural rights in the run-up to decisions on the application of those norms affects how states perceive the fairness of those decisions. And third, decision makers react to denial of procedural rights with a kind of a non-rational behavior. And the two cases I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, they actually support these propositions. As mentioned, African states acknowledged the R2P norm in the African Union's Constitutive Act and the protection of civilian norm in different resolutions, but made their assent dependent on the condition that the African Union decides on the exercise of these norms in Africa. That is, the African Union has made it clear again and again that it's not the Security Council, it is not extracontinental powers that decide on the implementation of protection norms in Africa. It is the African Union itself. In the case of Libya, the intervening coalitions of states completely ignored the African Union. African leaders had developed a kind of a roadmap for resolving the crisis through negotiations, and they had assumed that Resolution 1973 would bring Gaddafi to the table. Now, just as a high-level African Union panel was about to embark on a mediation mission, the coalition closed the Libyan airspace and began the bombing campaign, and thereby frustrated the African Union's mediation efforts. As a result, and the African Union later was completely cut out of the process. As a result, the African Union reacted defiantly, refused to take part in conferences on the post-war settlement, and distanced itself from the R2P norm. In the Côte d'Ivoire, things played out completely differently. The African Union took the lead in implementing Resolution 1975 and was given time to negotiate a peaceful solution of the crisis. Again, this was a preferred outcome. They wanted to have a kind of a compromise settlement between Gbagbo and his opponent. And it was only after the African Union representatives realized that Gbagbo would not accept a compromise and that the alternative to removing him from power would be a full-blown civil war, that they then consented to the use of force by French and UN troops. And this sense of process control furthered the African Union's commitment to the protection of civilians' norm and its willingness to cooperate with the UN in peacekeeping. So, to resolve this puzzle, procedural fairness played a decisive role, and the granting of procedural fairness in the case of Côte d'Ivoire led to a very constructive behavior, and the denial of procedural control, procedural justice in the case of Libya led to frustration, anger, and very destructive reactions. To conclude, it is still too early to determine whether the return of great power competition that we witness right now is real and will supplant global governance. However, if global governance is here to stay, justice concerns should be taken serious. Any reform of the international order and its norms that redistribute obligations and restrict states' freedom of action will only be accepted if it reflects shared principles of procedural fairness. And as long as a comprehensive Security Council reform is pending, this applies then that regional organizations should have a say in the application of global norms. Thus, and that is, I believe, I'm convinced that devolving responsibility from the global to the regional level is an opportunity rather than a risk for realizing global governance. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to questions, all the questions or comments that you might have.
So, the floor is open for questions, comments, clarifications. Alberto, please. I think we have to use the microphone, right? Yeah. With microphone. I try to get it in your direction, but I'm not sure because it's kind of stuck here.
Thank you very much. Congratulations, Matthias, for your excellent explanation for your project that is insightful in my view. I have two questions. My first question refers to the relationship, the influence that the Habermas concept of procedural justice exercise on your conception of procedural justice. Is a more theoretical question. And the second question, you expounded about the procedural justice, and I want to inquire about the relationship between procedural justice and substantive justice when we discuss the responsibility to protect. If we analyze humanitarian interventions, military humanitarian interventions in the last decades of the 20th century, mainly after the end of the Cold War, when there was a kind of political concert in the realm of the United Nations Security Council. And after that, in the Kosovo, for example, and when we focus humanitarian interventions or military interventions, to say better, in the 21st century. There is an intrinsic relationship between the legitimacy of the procedure, in the case of the United Nations procedure, the competence of the United Nations Security Council to define the hypothesis of breach to peace and acts of aggression or threat to peace, and the composition of the United Nations Security Council without a possible manifestation by the UN General Assembly, for example, which could be one way to implement or to grant more legitimacy to procedural justice. There is an intrinsic connection between this procedural conception of justice and the responsibility to protect after the famous Kofi Annan report and the substantive concept of justice, the result produced, results that go beyond the promised effect of the humanitarian intervention with casualties, with civilian casualties, in many cases children, elderly, and this ends up contaminating the final result of the humanitarian intervention. And my question is, my question goes towards this main dimension of your conception. How do you view this connection at present day?
You want to respond directly?
I'm sure whether I've got the first question. The first question was on the relationship between... Sorry? Sorry, I didn't get that. Habermas perception. I'm not... Communicative action, okay.
You are from Frankfurt. You should be an expert on Habermas.
Okay.
I think that's the underlying assumption here.
I think that there's similarities. I mean, as far as I understand Habermas in a way that Habermas argues that it is possible to establish communication beyond power structures. That is, we should, in certain settings, are able to communicate and find find common ground via communication, and the best way to do that. I mean, there are probably, I haven't thought about that, there are probably similarities, but this idea of procedural justice always deals with authority in a certain way. It always deals with, or authority is at the center of this whole idea. It always deals with the question of how actors affected by authoritative rules perceive this rule and react to it. I think the best case is if you, for example, imagine a company. Business is bad, the boss has to fire, I don't know, a certain percentage of the employees. Now the question is, can that be done in a way that affected people, although they might have to go, nevertheless perceive this as understandable, as fair, or whether they have the feeling that they are fired not because they fulfill some objective criteria, but that they are fired because the boss has or pursues ulterior motives. And so you see the similarities to Habermas, but maybe also differences. The second question was on
the relationship between civil and substantive justice
in terms of.
In terms of the responsibility.
The idea here is that states have subscribed to a general norm. And this norm also is a kind of, or could be understood as a kind of substantial justice, or as a kind of distributive norm. It redistributes rights between states and individuals, right? This norm is a very abstract norm, and the question is, how is it going to be implemented in concrete cases, and who is implementing it? And are those institutions and actors that are responsible for implementing this norm, do they act fairly? Do they implement this norm in a rightful way, or do they implement it in a way that is not rightful? And that, of course, that is always it's difficult to ascertain for actors that are involved or that are affected by those decisions. And procedural justice procedures are, in my view, the most important dimension that decides whether affected actors perceive a certain distributive decision as legitimate or not. So in a certain way, procedural justice is an additional, or is the kind of additional dimension of legitimacy next to the legitimacy dimension that we know, that it input legitimacy and output legitimacy. So the question whether states have been whether the voice of states have been heard when formulating the norm, and whether the norm actually leads to expected results. And again, this implementation is, I guess I would say, it's an additional source of legitimacy that has so far been overlooked, but is very important when it comes to the question if affected states accept and implementation decision or not.
Maybe just to complement, I wonder whether there is not a third dimension. And I was a bit confused also by you using distributive justice for the norms as such. Wouldn't it be better to say for the norm as such, like the idea of responsibility to protect vulnerable populations in the case that their host state is not willing or able to do it, could be a norm, could be termed the kind of substantive justice. And then in that sense, procedural justice would be the application process, if you want, and then distributive could refer to the results. So does the norm actually achieve what it was intended to achieve? I mean, when I think of distributive justice, to me, kind of intuitively, it sounds more like something that refers to the output rather than to the substance of the norm. You have your own.
I mean, I have incorporated this distributive justice element from social psychology, from this field. And I would actually translate it into substantive norms, or the substantive content of a norm. And usually, I mean, the substantive content means that norms redistribute material and immaterial goods. Yeah? States are obliged to do certain things, and they were not obliged to do that before. So the norm changes the distributive relationships between actors. And so far, I would then indeed stick to this meaning of distributive justice in the sense that this defines the substance of a norm.
Other questions? Alumnos, por favor. Okay. Yeah, you need to use the mic, and it's not very mobile, so it just goes until here. So unfortunately, you have to come forward.
Thank you, Professor. I have two questions. First of all, in the specific case of Libya, if you don't consider that the historical perspective is more important than the concept of justice that you bring. I say this because Gaddafi has a colonial importance for all the African countries. I remember in 2011 that a lot of African friends said was worried about the Gaddafi because it was important for Angola, for example, for Mozambique. So the French attacking Libya was they were worried about this situation, not about the justice. And I would like to ask you if you consider using this typification into the International Criminal Court, because the African countries usually don't think the International Criminal Court are responsive. I don't know, the legitimate. And in this case, the importance of the person is equal. For example, when Uhuru Kenyatta or Omar al-Bashir is in International Criminal Court, all the African states say that it's not legitimacy. But when it's a warlord in Congo, you can blame. So
Right.
it's different, the perspective. Sorry for bad English.
Oh, no. Both very, very good questions, excellent questions. The first question concerning Gaddafi's standing, I allude to in my talk. I mean, this is exactly one of the case-specific explanations that a lot of people would use to resolve this puzzle. Why was the African Union so upset in the case of Libya and not so upset in the case of the Côte d'Ivoire? And they would then argue that Gaddafi's standing in Africa was so great that people were just getting really so angry when he was removed from power. I've looked into this, and I actually think it's not true. I mean, Gaddafi is, I mean, of course, he has, on the one hand, his reputation as, he had this nickname, what was it, the Lion of Africa or something like this. So he was, I mean, he had a very good standing, but still he was also very controversial. And he was very controversial because he interfered in the affairs of other African states, and actually his standing was not as good as, at least among his peers. His standing among his peers was not as good as one would imagine. On the other hand, Gbagbo, I mean, he was very successful in styling him as a kind of African socialist who stands up against the French. And I mean, his standing was also very well. So I don't think that these different reputations explains the puzzle. The second question concerning the ICC. Again, I would say that justice and justice considerations play a great role in explaining the African reactions to the court and to the verdicts of the court, how the court behaves. I mean, in the beginning, and that was surprising actually, that many African states signed on to the Rome Treaty, and the International Criminal Court would not have come about without support from Africa. This turned sour, or the relationship between Africa and the court turned sour, as you mentioned already, when the court started the trial against al-Bashir. What the African states at those times asked was, they were not opposed, or at least not completely opposed against bringing al-Bashir before the court. They argued that we have here two competing goals, or two competing norms. We have on the one hand the norm of impunity, and on the other hand we have the norm of peace. And they argued that bringing al-Bashir before the court at this concrete moment in history would undermine the peace process. And in my view, that's a very strong argument. So the African Union always then tried to convince the Security Council that the Security Council uses its right to defer the trial against al-Bashir. And the Security Council didn't care. Again, the African Union was cut out when it comes to procedural rights. How should the court behave in Africa in concrete circumstances? And how should the court react when norms collide? And is it fair if the court just ignores the pleas for peace? And is it fair if the court just denies the peace norm and just goes for the non-impunity norm? And is it fair if African voices are not heard and if African voices are ignored in this context? And so my argument would be, it's a very similar situation. The feeling of injustice in this al-Bashir case then triggered a kind of a backlash against the court. And the same was repeated then in the Kenya case.
Yeah, but I'm not just to compliment. I was also actually thinking about asking a similar question about the ICC and to what extent this can be applied. And I was wondering also if now that you talked about the al-Bashir case, if it's really this particular case, or if there wasn't even before that a perception that the ICC was going disproportionately against only African states, because I think even before this al-Bashir case was opened, and I think there were a number of other cases under investigation and where there were kind of preliminary examinations, etc., and all of them were from Africa. I think until the late 2000s, there were only cases from Africa, or even into the 2010s. I don't remember when the first investigations into non-African states or regions began. And I think that also was triggered or created a perception among the African leaders that there is a disproportionate targeting of Africa from the state of the ICC. Yeah, but I'm not sure if, I mean, would you say that it's basically that it's mainly the al-Bashir case that triggered the backlash, or could it be a broader perception of injustice against Africa?
No, Peter, you're right. I forgot to mention that. Of course, there was always this complaint about selectivities and double standards, and this feeling that only Africans are put before the court and nobody else. But still, before al-Bashir, the attitudes in Africa were rather mixed, and a lot of NGOs, a lot of states in Africa argued that, okay, I mean, we have the situation that only Africans are before the court, but still. It is an important instrument to guarantee this norm of impunity, and I think I'm rather sure that the situation really changed with this al-Bashir case. Al-Bashir made the important or the decisive the important difference, and then put the African unions and many African states on a track against the ICC.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think that you already made, right? That as long as the ICC went against warlords, it was still okay. Many African states were still kind of could live with that because it was usually against rebels that were threatening them. But once they go against a sitting, I don't know if he's president or if it's a parliamentary or presidential regime, I don't know. Dictator, a sitting dictator, sitting head of state, then of course the perception maybe changed. Huh? All right, any other questions, comments? Yes, Antonio. You have to do some exercise also.
Well, first of all, thank you for your talk, your presentation. My question is actually more general. We are dealing mostly with the sphere of the norms, and it's like more like an institutional approach from where I stand and where I see. And I understand this procedural element as the institutional implementation of, for instance, a given decision. But I was wondering if we could perhaps analyze the degree by which a typology of violations could favor an analysis or a relationship on how consensual the responses may be. So I'm just thinking if we could perhaps discuss if there is some variability in between, for instance, war crimes or war crimes against humanity tribunals, which are taken and implemented posterior to the conflict itself, and the degree by which they might be more consensual than, say, for instance, humanitarian interventions which are taking place on an ongoing event. So if there is a relationship between the typology of violations, the momentum in which it is implemented, and the degree by which this can interfere on this element, this variable of procedural intervention and consensual implementation of a decision. So I guess it's like a more broad question, but it has to be with the typology coming from the violations themselves instead of the norms regarding the decision overall.
Well, I guess I'm not arguing that procedures and procedural justice explains everything. Of course, there are other factors that come into play here. Still, I would argue that I mean, for all those norms, you always need a procedural annex, and of course, then the procedural justice would be more important if the implementation of a certain norm is controversial or not. I mean, if the implementation of a certain norm is not controversial, if everybody agrees that the norm has been, or if things are so clear that everybody can see and agrees that a norm has been implemented in a rightful way, then of course procedures are probably not that important. When norms are abstract, when norms could be implemented in different ways, when people are strongly affected by how norms are implemented, I mean, then I guess procedures become more important. I hope this explains your, or answers your question, I'm not sure, but...
I mean, like, it's a very broad question.
Okay.
I was just wondering, for instance, especially if it's easier, to put it more simple, for instance, it's easier for you to constantly implement tribunal posterior to a war in which humanitarian violations were taking place, like ad hoc tribunal, posterior to the event. It's easier to do that in a more consensual manner than, for instance, implement an intervention during a civil war. So it's like related to, I was just wondering, because of brainstorming regarding the technology. But in a way, you kind of answered.
Okay.
So
Okay.
question.
Okay. Okay.
Yes, I was just asking. Please, a girl should ask a question now.
Yeah.
And here we go, Juliane.
Thanks, Professor. I thought it was very interesting, this approach regarding justice and justice claims. Then your conclusion that we should pay attention to justice claims, especially norms of procedural justice. Then at first I also thought about Habermas' conception of procedural justice. And then I asked myself, if it's not this concept you're using, then I don't know how to think about procedural justice as... It seems you were talking about kind of universal concept of procedural justice, because then I thought, like, can we shape this concept of justice? I mean, we can say we are hearing African voices, but then which voices? You know, where do these claims of justice come from? Basically, this is the question. How to shape them, how to identify them, if it is... You know, that's it.
I mean, you're again, very good point. And let me see how I should answer to it. I mean, first of all, of course, justice is a very, very difficult concept. And a lot of people, like the German international lawyer Kelsen, he always argued that justice is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, justice means very different things to very different people. Something that I find just, you might find completely unjust. So that's an extremely difficult concept, where I think, and that's also why many people also in the field of social psychology argue that the procedural aspect might even be more important than the substantive justice conceptions. My argument would be basically that in the field of international relations, of interstate relations, justice is always negotiated. Justice is something that is expressed in agreed norms. As I said, the problem is that even if states agree to certain standards that represent fairness criteria, even if they agree to those standards, you still have this insecurity. What really is meant if we talk about R2P? What really is meant if you talk about climate justice? Nobody knows that exactly. And so we try to specify that, but then again, there's still this zone of insecurity when it comes to implementing abstract norms. And here the role of procedures come in, and they are probably even more important than the substance of the norms themselves, or the substance of justice. Second part of the question, I mean, whose voices are heard? Problem is that international relations is still a kind of, or IR is still a discipline where states are important actors. And in the studies I have done, I try to be simple, and I try to just argue that it is important that states implement certain norms. So I look at heads of states and not at different groups within society. It's a simplification, I know that, but I guess for the things I want to do and want to show, it works.
Yeah, but even among states, you have some whose voices are more easily heard than others, right?
Exactly true. I mean, that's the reason why, I mean, this I said is probably one of the reasons why states try to organize themselves and why they try to organize themselves in regional security organizations. Of course, voice opportunities are also distributed unequally within regional security organizations, sure. But still, as long as local states use regional security organizations as an instrument to organize themselves, as an instrument to control external influence in their region, we should take them serious, and we should take their voices serious. But of course, you're completely right. I mean, if you look at the African reactions to the ICC, I mean, you see very different responses, ranging from, I don't know, South Africa, which wanted to withdraw from the ICC, to Botswana, who is still a strong defender of the ICC. And of course, then you see that also, you see within the African Union, you see those differences. And you have to look very carefully. But still, I think that given all those differences and nuances, that this concept of procedures and how important voices, important local voices are represented in global organizations, and whether they have influence and a say on the implementation of global norms, that is an important thing.
Any other questions? Well, let me make one more question. Well, actually, I haven't made any questions so far. When the Security Council decided on the application of, or on the how do you say, on this resolution regarding Libya, you had two states among those that were abstaining, which were Germany and Brazil, right? Coincidentally.
And China.
And China, yes. But let's focus on Germany and Brazil, because we have Germans and Brazilians here in the room. And by coincidence, I happened to be in Brazil when this voting occurred. And I remember some debates also with IR professors on whether, well, they actually endorsed the abstention of Brazil, whereas in Germany, I think most academics were very critical about the abstention of Germany in this decision. So I wonder, what were the motives? I mean, are there any parallels between the motives? I assume that the motives are very different for Germany on the one hand and Brazil on the other to abstain from this voting. And can you make anything out of this in terms of these justice questions? For instance, I mean, in the Brazilian case, is that a question of, did Brazil, by not endorsing this, by not supporting this resolution, is that a critique of the norm of R2P, or is it a critique of the decision-making process, or both? And in the case of Germany, I don't know, what would you say?
The first part of your question concerning the issue whether justice motivations explain the German and the Brazilian abstention. I'm not sure. I mean, first of all, Germany and Brazil were not directly affected. The intervention took place in Africa, and it was the Africans who felt directly affected, and it was the Africans who felt that they should have a voice. I mean, Germany was a bystander, and Brazil also was a bystander. And I guess that in the case of Brazil, I mean, I don't know the debate about Brazil very, very well, but my understanding was that in the case of Brazil, the abstention was motivated by a couple of reasons. First of all, that this resolution gives too much leeway to the intervening states, and that the Security Council should not or should try to guard against misuse of authorizing resolutions. In the case of Germany, I am not so sure. I mean, in the case of Germany, the problematic thing was that our then foreign minister was in the forefront of those states criticizing Gaddafi, asking for sanctions, demanding that Gaddafi should be put before the ICC. So in a certain way, Germany signaled that it would go along with the coalition. Then in the last moment, expecting that the Americans would not themselves intervene, in the last moment the Germans withdrew, and I think there were a lot of domestic reasons for that.
More questions? Last chance. All right, then I would like to thank our guest Matthias Dembinski very much for your talk and for your engagement in the discussion, and to the audience as well for being here, for participating, for posing questions, or for just patiently listening. And yeah, thank you for being here, and maybe see some of you tomorrow at the workshop or on some other occasion at another seminar of the Department of Political Science. Thank you and good night.
Aber das war, glaube ich, direkt mal 20 Minuten Vortrag. So schnell ist noch niemand fertig geworden.
Ich dachte, es würde doch länger dauern. Aber es ist ja nicht. Na gut.